Hello everyone, my name is Rachel. Welcome back to my channel. Today I'm doing quite a different video for me. I don't usually do videos that are so negative, but I did want to start off this series of like my 2019 wrap-up videos by talking about the most disappointing / worst books that I read in 2019. So all of these books are books that I read the whole way through. I'm not going to talk about books that I DNF'd just because I don't think it's fair to rant about a book that I didn't complete. So I'm only talking about books that I have actually read the entire thing. And with all of these books, I didn't rate them any lower than 2 stars. So because I didn't rate any of these books 1 star, I did think it was more accurate to call this video the most disappointing books, because while most of these books aren't awful, I did have expectations for them that just were not met by any stretch of the imagination. So I have about 7 books to talk about today, and without further ado, let's just get into it. The first book I want to talk about is Us Against You by Fredrik Backman. This is the sequel to Beartown, and this one I definitely was disappointed by because I liked Beartown so much. I gave that book 4 stars, and basically Beartown just centers around this one town and how they are just absolutely obsessed with their hockey teams. I think they have like a hockey team of younger boys and then more of like a varsity team of older teens. And so that book featured a lot of characters. We had to keep track of a lot of different POVs in that story, but I did think it was done well. I liked how the story progressed in Beartown, and at the end of Beartown, everything was wrapped up in a neat little bow. We even progressed like 10 years into the future, I believe. Like the very last chapter was like an epilogue, and it was 10 years in the future, and we checked back in with all of the main characters that were featured. So the story was over in my opinion, but then this sequel happened, and I literally put in my Goodreads review, I put AKA the sequel I never asked for. And maybe I shouldn't have even read this book, like maybe that's my mistake, but also at the same time, I do remember a lot of people raving about this installment, so I thought that I might as well give it a chance. And so I read it. I read the whole thing on audio because I had heard that the audiobook was really well done. And I do have to say the narrator who did both the first book and this book does a really great job. But yeah, to say I was disappointed would be quite the understatement. I did end up giving this 2 stars. And while in Beartown, I did think the amount of characters worked. In this installment, there are even more characters to keep track of, and I'm not sure if listening to the audiobook helped me or hurt me in that respect. And I do know that I was basically listening to this audiobook while driving to and from opera rehearsals. I can distinctly remember listening to this in January of this year. And I do remember that I started to zone out part of the way through, so I do think that also hindered my complete comprehension and understanding of what was going on and who all these characters were, because I just wasn't caring enough about what was happening. And I did end up, listening to the whole thing because I was kind of interested in seeing what would happen in the end. But for me, the plot was just so meh. Everything about this book just didn't need to happen. And I recently found out that there's going to be a 3rd book in this series, and I just why? I just do not understand how this needs to be a trilogy at all. So yeah, I'm just so not a fan of this book. Also, I guess as just a general disclaimer, if you loved these books that I'm talking about, honestly, good for you. I wish that I loved all the books that I read this year, but that is unfortunately not the case. And if you did love any of these books, I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments below of your reasoning behind why you loved them, because I do find it interesting when one reader loves a book that another reader hates. So definitely let me know your thoughts in the comments below. But yeah, this just did not work for me. Like I said, I just don't think this needed to exist. I would only recommend reading this second book if you absolutely loved Beartown, gave it 5 stars, loved all of the characters, and you just need more of them in your life, then yes, I would recommend this. But if you're like me and you enjoyed Beartown, but you are not obsessed with it, then you will probably not like this book at all. Okay, now we're moving on to another book that I almost gave this one actually 1 star, but the ending did redeem it a little bit for me, and that is Side Effects May Vary by Julie Murphy. I was actually really looking forward to reading this book because I was looking forward to checking out Julie Murphy in general. She is the author of Dumplin', which I still haven't read yet. And after reading this book, I'm not the most excited about getting to it, even though it is on my bookshelf over here. I have it. I would like to read it this year because I've had it on my shelves for a long time. But yeah, after reading this book, I'm really not excited about it. My main problem with this book is the protagonist, which is a really big problem. If you're not rooting for the protagonist, what is the point, you know? This is another book that I listened to on audio while I was driving back and forth to opera rehearsal. So I do think if I was reading the physical book, I probably would have DNF'd it, but it was just an easy audiobook to keep listening to. So basically this is about this girl, Alice, I believe, and she is diagnosed with cancer. I can't remember what specific kind of cancer. And so because she pretty much knows that she's going to die, she decides to get revenge on all the people that have done her wrong in her life. And she ends up dragging her best friend Harvey into it. And Harvey, I just feel so bad for in this book because he loves Alice so much. And she just leads him on the entire book, basically. They're kind of on again, off again. I can't remember how the two of them end up in the end of the book because I just don't care. She exacts revenge on all these people. Then she finds out she's not going to die. I think she goes into remission. And then when all of these people that she's like pulled pranks on and done different things to exact revenge back on her, she is like so shell-shocked. And I'm just like, really, bitch? Like, you really didn't expect people to get back at you after what you did to them? Like, what? Like, how am I supposed to root for you when you're just such a terrible protagonist?
Stop it. Get some help.
You know, going back to her relationship with Harvey, you know, she leads him on, they kind of break up, so he starts dating somebody else. And then Alice has the nerve to be so pissed off at both Harvey and this girl that he is now dating. And I'm just like, really, girl? You have no right to be upset when you're the one who led him on and then dumped him. And the only reason why I gave this 2 stars was because towards the end, she did finally get what was coming to her, and she did start to kind of redeem herself towards the end of the book. But honestly, in my opinion, I never felt like she was ever actually genuine, even at the end of the book. Also, I felt like all of the characters had like no personality. This is also the only book on this list that I would totally steer you away from. All of the other books I'm going to talk about, I can totally understand why some people would like them, but this book is just so terrible. Do not read it. Just don't. Just stay away. So the next book I want to talk about is something that I was more just disappointed by. I did give this one 3 stars, so it's not the most terrible book that I've ever read or anything, but it was one that I had really high expectations for, and that is The Handmaid's Tale by Margaret Atwood. If you have been following me for a while, you will know that I actually did my very first reading vlog ever all about my experience reading this book because I had assumed that I was gonna give it 5 stars and that I would just have a lot of things to rave about in that vlog. I'll link it in the cards above, but it ended up being quite a disappointment, and so I feel like that vlog is a fail because it's like 20 minutes of me talking about how this book is just okay. The main thing that I feel like a lot of people have issue with this book is that there's actually no real plot. Like, we get a lot of exposition, we get a lot of flashbacks, you know, as to kind of how Gilead came to be, but there's no actual like story arc of events that I could explain to you, even if I were to include all of the spoilers. It's just kind of Offred going through her days, living her life in Gilead, and I don't know, it just ended up being kind of tedious and boring to get through. I think one of the things that made this book frustrating for me is that we would be going along at a really good pace with Offred in present day, and then the action would just stop and we would go to a flashback that wasn't all that interesting and didn't like contribute all that much to the story. I think the flashbacks are definitely what made this book flag in terms of pacing. I'm glad that this book is fairly short, but at the same time, there definitely needed to be more page time contributed to the formation of Gilead and how everything happened leading up to where we are in present day in this book. We would get snippets here and there and flashbacks, but we never got the full story. And maybe Margaret Atwood goes into that in The Testament, which I think is the title of the sequel, but I've also heard that that book is kind of bad too, so I have no plans to read it. But yeah, I feel like when you are setting up a world that is so unique like the Republic of Gilead is, you really need to build that world for your readers, because how else are we supposed to know how and why the world is the way it is? Basically everything that I've listed here in my complaints, the Hulu series just does so much better. So I would totally recommend checking out that series if you are interested in this world and in this story. But yeah, unfortunately I can't really recommend this book, and I did end up giving it 3 stars, but part of me kind of wants to give it more of a 2.5, but I think I am going to stick to my rating of 3 stars. Okay guys, we're gonna talk about another major disappointment for me, and that is unfortunately the 3rd and final book in a series that I actually was enjoying quite a bit. That is Ruin and Rising by Leigh Bardugo. This is the 3rd and final book in the Grisha trilogy, or the Shadow and Bone trilogy, and what really makes this so disappointing for me is that I loved book 1. Shadow and Bone for me was such a solid start. I gave that one 4 stars. I was really looking forward to reading the other 2 books. Siege and Storm was just okay. I think I gave that one like 3 or 3.5 stars, and then this book happened. I ended up giving this 2 stars. For me, I will say I loved the final battle scene. I made a note of that in my Goodreads review. I thought it was like the perfect way to end this series. But other than that, this book is just so boring.
You are boring. B-O-R-N-I-N.
Oh my goodness, there were just so many points throughout this book where, I don't know, I feel like the characters were going on a lot of journeys throughout this book, and so there wasn't much dialogue or action happening, and I like just didn't care. Also, Leigh Bardugo introduced so many side characters. I think in Siege and Storm, she introduced a lot of these side characters, and then they were featured quite a bit in this book, but she just didn't develop them. So like, why was I supposed to care about any of them? It just kind of turned into me reading names on a page. This book also lacked a lot of the Darkling and Nikolai, and those 2 characters for me were what made this series so interesting. There were quite a few times too that I can distinctly remember I had to force myself to pick up this book. And you're probably thinking to yourself, Rachel, why didn't you just DNF it? Because I had read the other 2 books and I wasn't gonna give up on the series at this point, you know? I just don't know. I'm so conflicted about this book and this series, as you can tell, but I am still really looking forward to reading the Six of Crows duology and King of Scars, because I've heard really great things about those books and they take place in the same world. So overall, I'm glad that I read this series because it did give me a good taste of the world and all these different characters and things like that. But yeah, this was just such a letdown, and I'm just sad and upset. Okay, this is another book that I was disappointed by, but at the same time I didn't have the highest of expectations. So this was just not a good fantasy YA story. This is Spin the Dawn by Elizabeth Lim. I feel like this book was all over BookTube, not because anyone actually read it, but because whoever the publisher is, you know, sent out arcs all over the place, and so a lot of people were just talking about the premise because it was marketed as basically Mulan meets Project Runway, and everybody was really intrigued by that, but I feel like nobody has actually read this book but me. I don't know. So it's about this girl named Maya, and basically her father, who is very old and very sick, is contacted by a representative of the emperor of this Asian-inspired fantasy world. Basically, they're searching for a new tailor for the emperor, and so she dresses herself up as a boy so that she can compete to be the tailor because her father is too old and sick, and so she sneaks off and goes to the emperor's palace. So in that respect, it is very Mulan inspired. And so then there's this competition. So my thing with this book is that I thought that that was going to be the entire plot of the entire book, and then subsequent books would go beyond that. but basically it's really only the first half of the book that is dedicated to this competition. Then at around the halfway mark, it just completely switches to another plot line where Maya and this guy, they have to go on this quest together to get these items for the Emperor. And oh man, this just took such a turn at around the halfway mark. I was probably going to give this book like 3.5 stars, but the second half of the book was just tedious, boring. I just didn't care that I lowered my rating down to 2 stars. The characters were just okay. The romance was just okay in this as well. I try my best not to DNF a book if I get well past the halfway mark, and it was around like the 60 to 70% mark that I kind of wanted to stop reading it, but I just kept going because I really wanted to finish it in order to fully review it for you guys. Okay guys, this is another book that I'm actually really sad to talk about because I had such high hopes for this book because it's by an author that I did fall in love with back in 2018, and that is Birthday by Meredith Russo. I read If I Was Your Girl by the same author in 2018, and loved it so much. It was one of my favorite books of the year, and so I was really looking forward to this book, but this one really let me down, and I ended up giving it a 3-star rating. So basically this is about these two best friends, Eric and Morgan, and they share the same birthday, and so basically the book is told on their birthdays from about age 13 to age 18, and I think the book only takes place on their birthdays and not on any other day of the year. And so I do have to say I enjoyed that aspect that we got to see how they were changing from year to year, and I loved the friendship between these two characters. Basically the whole premise is about how Morgan is discovering that she's trans, and so she wants to be a woman. And so throughout this book, she's kind of discovering her femininity and coming to terms with that and trying to figure out how she can fully become the woman that she wants to be. And my main issue with this book is that it just didn't impact me as emotionally as I had hoped or thought that it would. Mainly, I just feel like I couldn't really emotionally connect to the characters. This was like a 6-hour audiobook, and I just didn't feel like that was enough time for me to get to know Eric and Morgan and their family and friends and the full scope of their story and their relationship. And to me, the book wasn't much more than Eric kind of being forced to keep playing football by his dad, and then Morgan getting bullied a lot because she's trans, and I just felt like there wasn't much more to the story than that. And I feel like Meredith Russo definitely missed an opportunity, especially when Morgan finally started going to therapy. We kind of just breezed through that, and I was like, wait, what? Like, I actually wanted to know about her therapy sessions and, you know, how she was coping with being trans and being bullied and all of these things. It's very fast how Eric and Morgan go from being friends to being boyfriend and girlfriend, and it just, to me, wasn't developed nearly enough. You know, throughout the book we get a sense that Morgan really has a huge crush on Eric, but then it's just like a switch goes off and Eric immediately reciprocates Morgan's feelings, and it's just, I don't know, it was just so fast and just unrealistic because it was so fast. I'm just really sad that I didn't love it as much as a lot of other people in the booktube community have, and I am still really looking forward to seeing Meredith Russo come out with more and more books because I know that I appreciate her as an author, but this book just wasn't for me. Alright guys, we have one last book to talk about, and this is another one that I really expected a lot out of because it is such an American classic. I just assumed that I was gonna give this 5 stars, but I unfortunately didn't, and that is To Kill a Mockingbird by Harper Lee. I did end up giving this 3 stars. So again, it's not the worst book I've ever read, but it was definitely a huge letdown for me. I tried reading the physical book for this, but I got about 40 pages in and I was just so bored, and it was just such a tedious reading process for me. So I did end up switching to the audiobook, and that definitely helped. For one thing, I assumed that this book would have focused so much more on the plot line with Tom Robinson and his trial, you know, basically that a white woman has accused him of raping her, and then Atticus, who is Scout's father, is his lawyer, and is trying to defend him in this case. But really, this book ended up being so much more about Scout, Jem, Atticus, and all these people that live in the neighborhood around them. And to be honest, I just didn't really care about any of these characters. We finally got, you know, the trial and all of that about halfway through the book, and I loved that part of the book, and I think that's a huge reason why I didn't give this a lower rating, was because that trial was just so interesting, and I loved the discussions being brought up about racism and prejudice in general. Unfortunately, the last 20% or so of this book was focused on Scout again, and I expected to love Scout's character so much because I feel like she seems to be such an iconic literary character, but I just really didn't connect with her. I also felt like her inner monologue and her way of speaking was far advanced for like a 6/7-year-old girl. The only character that I really liked was Atticus. I did also appreciate Tom Robinson's character, but we don't get a lot of like him or his point of view. But Atticus I did really appreciate, especially when he was actually in the courtroom talking to the jury and things like that. And overall, I can see why this book was so revolutionary at the time that it was written. This was published in 1960, I believe. But to me, this is not the kind of book that stands the test of time. It just feels very dated. Also, the ending of this book was really confusing and rushed, and I still don't really understand what actually happened. So yeah, all of those things just kind of combined together to make me just not really like this book all that much. All right, everyone, that's going to be it for this video. Like I said, if you loved these books, I would love it if you would leave your thoughts down in the comments below, or if you share similar thoughts to me, I would also love to hear that as well. I do hope that you enjoyed this video and that you would consider liking and subscribing, and I thank you in advance if you do. And with that being said, I'll see you guys in the next video. Bye!